This presentation is on the Twin Cities tornado outbreak that happened on May 6, 1965. This night would be the worst tornado outbreak in Twin Cities history. This presentation will stick with official storm data from that evening. Over the years, there's been some controversy as to how many tornadoes actually touched down that night and exact tracks of those tornadoes. According to the official storm data, there were 6 tornadoes, 5 of which were in the metropolitan area, and a 6th tornado was just west of the metro in Sibley and McLeod counties. Of the 6 tornadoes, 4 of those were rated F4. 2 of those passed over Fridley. 1 was rated an F3, and the other produced F2 damage. These tornadoes altogether destroyed approximately 2,500 homes and caused $51 million in property damage. These tornadoes resulted in 13 fatalities and 683 injuries. Some of the hardest hit areas from this outbreak in the Twin Cities included Norwood, Young America, Waconia, Chanhassen, the Lake Minnetonka area, Fridley, Spring Lake Park, and Mounds View. The map on the right shows where the greatest wind damage occurred that evening, either from tornadic or non-tornadic winds. The damage extended from the southwest metro, from Sibley, McLeod County into Carver County, into Hennepin County, and then heading north towards Anoka County. This outbreak was also a series of firsts for the Twin Cities. It was the first time that civil defense sirens were used for severe weather. Up until May 6th, the primary purpose of the sirens were to warn of nuclear attacks, as the United States was in the midst of a Cold War. This was also the first time that radio provided coverage of the storm from pretty much from start to end, as WCCO-AM provided 6 hours of continuous weather coverage. And this storm was also named the 5th most significant weather event of the 20th century by the Minnesota Climatology Office. Prior to this tornado outbreak, 1965 was a busy year. In April, there was record flooding along the Mississippi, Minnesota, and St. Croix rivers. This flooding was caused by a combination of excessively deep frost, a late winter snowstorm, and heavy rain that caused snowmelt during April. The ground was still frozen, which resulted in this liquid to run off into rivers and causing widespread flooding. As we turn to May 6th, by all accounts, it was a pleasant but muggy day. Skies were fair with just scattered clouds and light winds to start the day, but gradually increasing as the day went on. Temperatures had reached the upper 70s by the afternoon, with mid-60 dew points by the evening. A frontal boundary stalled right over the Twin Cities metro during the afternoon hours, which would be the focal point for thunderstorm activity. Here are a couple maps I pulled from that evening as of 7 p.m. On the left is a surface map showing a stationary front right over the Twin Cities, extending into southwest Minnesota and then further into the plains. Out ahead of it were strong south winds pulling rich Gulf moisture all the way up into Minnesota. On the right is a 500 millibar map showing an area of low pressure over northwestern North Dakota and winds from the southwest. Here is some upper air analysis from that evening. From the St. Cloud site, on the left is the sounding, showing that there is moderate instability in place with the Cape Valley around 1300 and a small cap, which is the SYN-H there at the bottom of the sounding. On the right is the hoodoo graph showing the speed of winds with height. There is a little bit of turning going on, suggesting that there is some tornadic possibility. As we got closer to the evening, the Weather Bureau radar detected storms starting to develop about 55 miles from Minneapolis at around 4:35, and then moved to about within 40 miles of the city within by 5 o'clock, as intensity was increasing with time. At around 5:45, the severe storms storm unit, which would become later the Storm Prediction Center, out of Kansas City, issued the following tornado forecast, which would be considered a watch in today's terminology. Um, Here's the text of the message. Basically, the threat for tornadoes existed from north central Iowa into southwest, south central, and portions of eastern Minnesota up into northwestern west central Wisconsin. Thunderstorms with large hail, damaging winds, and the possibility of isolated tornadoes were expected to occur from about 6 o'clock to 10 p.m. Um, and then this message was relayed by radio and television for the 6 o'clock newscast. And then after 6 o'clock, we would have what would become known as the longest night.
Official tornado warning.
As CCO radio came onto the air, the first tornado touched down at 6:08 near Cologne in Carver County. This tornado traveled north for 13 miles, uh, dissipating around Minnetrista in the Lake Minnetonka area. This tornado killed 3 people and it injured 175 people. This tornado went through the Lake Minnetonka area. One area that was hit hard was Navarre. Its business district downtown was just decimated. There was nothing left at County Roads 19 and 15. The second tornado occurred around 6:27 p.m. This was spotted by officials at Flying Cloud Airport. This tornado occurred um, around the intersection of the present-day Highway 212 and County Road 101. This tornado was on the ground for 7 miles, dissipating in Deep Haven and Hennepin County. There weren't any injuries or fatalities from this particular storm. This tornado that developed just south of Chanhassen moved into the downtown business district, and it damaged several businesses and also damaged or destroyed 65 homes, which is about 1/3 in Chanhassen, before moving on to Lotus Lake in the city and then traveling north to Minnetonka and Deep Haven. In Deep Haven, the Minnetonka Boat Works facility was severely damaged. The third tornado occurred around 6:34 p.m., right around the New Auburn area in Sibley County. This tornado was on the ground for about 16 miles, dissipating just west of Lester Prairie. There weren't any injuries or fatalities reported with this tornado. Not much was known from this tornado other than it damaged 40 farms and it wiped out the St. Peter Lutheran Church and School in Lester Prairie. The fourth tornado um, occurred at 7:43 p.m. In the Green Isle area in Sibley County. It was on the ground for 11 miles, dissipating 2 miles southwest of Waconia and Carver County. It killed 1 person and injured 175. Young America and Waconia were the hardest hit from this area. Local newspapers described the scene as total destruction in between the two towns. The damage path was around a half to 3/4 of a mile wide, and 20 farms between the two towns had all its structures destroyed. Here's a photograph I found of a tornado as it approached Norwood. On this evening, there weren't a lot of pictures of these tornadoes in the Twin Cities. This was one I just happened to come across as I was doing some research. And now we get towards the Fridley area. Uh, the first of the F4 tornadoes. The first one occurred around 7:06 in southwestern Fridley in Anoka County. Um, this one was on the ground for about 7 miles, dissipating in Blaine around Laddie Lake. This storm killed 3 people and injured 175 people. This particular tornado went through Anoka County Airport, damaging several planes and hangars. The last tornado of the evening occurred at 8:14 p.m. in Golden Valley. This was another one that traveled through Fridley eventually. This tornado was on the ground for 18 miles and dissipated around Centerville and Anoka County. It killed 6 people and injured 158. So now I'll focus on the 2 tornadoes that went through Fridley. They actually cross paths right in the heart of Fridley. Um, the 2 tornadoes cross paths about 20 minutes apart. Uh, Damage was actually quite extensive since it impacted central Fridley. About 1,525 homes were damaged or destroyed, which was roughly 25% of the homes in the city. Damage estimates to Fridley was around $14.5 million in 1965 dollars. One of the first areas to be impacted was the North Ordnance Industrial Plant. Uh, Actually, 2 tornadoes traveled over the plant, and damage was estimated at about $2 million in 1965 dollars. And these tornadoes went on to damage the schools within Fridley. The damage was said to be extensive. At the junior high school, there was a science fair going on. Luckily, there weren't too many injuries inside the school, very minor. Um, the senior high school was also impacted. The elementary school and the city hall were also damaged. Damage to the schools was around $5 million. The Fridley damage was described by one newspaper headline as utter devastation. Vice President Hubert Humphrey at the time toured the area and had said, "I have never seen anything like it. I have seen many disaster areas, but never one as bad as this that I can remember. The damage I've seen is comparable to a war, and I give you my good wishes, my best hopes, and my prayers." As you can see, yeah, buildings and homes were just completely demolished off the foundation. And on the right is what I believe is a school with the clock stopped around 7:10 p.m. Here are some more damage pictures from Fridley. On the left is a house with nothing left except for what appears to be an interior closet. And on the right is a structure that looks to be an apartment complex. That's why they tell you to get either to the lowest floor or into an interior closet. Many times that's the only part of the structure that's left when the tornado passes by. Here's another damage picture from Fridley, just showing how some homes were completely wiped out and then others were left standing with minor damage. So tornadoes are really sporadic. One home can be untouched and your next door neighbor could have its home completely flattened. Another picture from Fridley showing a home completely destroyed with just the chimney remaining. In regards to the Fridley tornadoes, uh, at once there was believed to be 3 tornadoes that moved through Fridley, but storm data was revised in 1973 to show that only 2 tornadoes tracked through Fridley instead of 3. This may have been because of the discovery of multiple vortice tornadoes, and that actually one tornado may have had multiple vortices that passed through Fridley. According to the official sources, the tornado that began in Chanhassen dissipated in Deep Haven, but the research from Thomas Gruzelis suggested that the tornado continued beyond Deep Haven, that it passed through Medicine Lake and Golden Valley before hitting Fridley at 7:10 p.m. And among accounts from Fridley residents, there's actually some discrepancies. I've seen some accounts where as many as 4 tornadoes have gone through the city, and then as many as few as 2. So there's just a wide range of opinion as to how many tornadoes actually went through Fridley. It's one of the unknowns to this day. What's known as there was likely a funnel cloud moving through central Hennepin County around Plymouth, the Crystal area, Brooklyn Center, before moving into Fridley. WCCO radio was credited with saving countless lives that evening as they provided about 6 hours of continuous coverage from about 6 o'clock to midnight. Dick Chapman and Charlie Boone were the commentators that evening. Charlie Boone retired from radio in 2010, and unfortunately Dick Chapman passed away at the end of February at the age of 84. The two of them coordinated tornado locations by taking color reports, which was unheard of at the time. Colors weren't put on the air for situations like this. And they used maps in the studio to pinpoint locations of the tornadoes and to call out areas in the path of the storm using maps. The station received 3 of the nation's top journalism awards in broadcasting for public service, including the Society of Professional Journalists Award, the DuPont Award, and the Peabody Award. I have a small sample of the radio coverage that night.
For the past hour and a half, we've been broadcasting solidly here about this brace of tornadoes that is skipping in and around the Twin City area. We don't know about damage or injuries as yet. We know there has been both damage and injuries. The only actual report of injuries comes from the Spring Lake Park area in the Minnetonka region, where Highway Patrol ambulances have been ordered about 45 minutes ago. Repeating that we know of a funnel now in the vicinity of either Shakopee or Eden Prairie, which would put it directly southwest of the Twin Cities area. It was in sight of a gentleman who we still have on the line here, and he could not tell whether it was touching ground. The Spring Lake Park damage that we just received apparently was from the tornado that went over our newsman, John Walker.
So that's a sample of the radio broadcast from that night. If you want to listen to more, head on over to radiotapes.com. At that site, they have 5 hours of coverage from WCCO. It's really interesting to listen to. It's definitely worth checking out. It really paints the picture of what actually happened that evening. In addition to radio, WCCO TV was on air broadcasting weather bulletins as they came through. Bud Kraling broke into programming with these weather bulletins. One of the relics that's in Mike Lynch's garage is this tornado warning sign that was displayed on TV when Bud Kraling broke in with these warnings. As I mentioned earlier, the civil defense sirens were used for the first time for severe weather. They provided an additional safety net. It made people tune into radio and television to find out what exactly was going on. And those tuning in may have been a little bit surprised to find out it was not a nuclear attack, since the sirens were used previously for these types of events. Some other points from this evening. In 1965, the average lead time for a tornado forecast or watch, whatever you want to call it, was about 1.5 hours. The tornado forecast for the Twin Cities that was issued was less than 45 minutes before the first tornado occurred in the metropolitan area, which was in Chanhassen. It was spotted by FAA officials at Flying Cloud Airport, Eden Prairie. The Weather Bureau had a group of observers, which were the spotters, in and around the suburbs, and they had not made any reports of suspicious weather activity prior to the first touchdown in Chanhassen. Uh, the National Spotter Network was restructured in 1970 into what's now known as Skywarn, and the Skywarn network has really been beneficial, and it's been really the eyes and ears of the National Weather Service since then, and they've really have done a great job um, spotting these storms. Uh, I also found out that the Weather Bureau radar was inoperative for a brief period of time during this event. It wasn't known if this was because of a malfunction or if it was just the radar operator taking the radar offline to make an observation. I'm just going to do a little then and now comparison over the last 50 years. The first area I'm going to touch on is radar. In 1965, the radar display image was just limited to the radar operator. The image was pretty crude. There was no real graphics component to it. There was no way to project the image onto a monitor for broadcasting. The technology wouldn't be available for about another 15 years later for projecting these images for broadcasting. In order to locate cities on the radar operator would often have to overlay a map to get locations. In over 50 years, the radar's improved greatly. As you can see, it's pretty graphics intensive. We're able to show cities. Intensities now have color. We've now switched to Doppler radar, which indicates winds within a storm to help indicate where the possibility of tornadoes might be. Radar is now available not just on TV, but now the internet and even your cell phone, you can pick up radar. As I mentioned earlier, it was about 15 years later before we were able to project color weather radar images onto a monitor for broadcasting. It wasn't until the late 1970s, early 1980s when this was available. Um, the radar in place in 1965 was based on World War II technology. The only way of detecting tornadoes was by looking at Hooke echoes on radar. This radar was installed sometime in the early 1960s and would be replaced about 35 years later by the NexRad Doppler radar. As I mentioned earlier, Doppler radar was a vast improvement over the early radar by being able to detect winds within a thunderstorm to better detect tornadoes. These next two slides will go over the population density between 1960 and 2010. Looking at 1960, you can see that the population was a little bit more tightly packed in the Minneapolis and St. Paul areas, with some growth around what's now the first ring suburbs. Carver and Scott counties didn't even have any data. That just shows how sparsely populated those areas were. And then as we get to 2010, you can see the spread of the population into Scott, Carver, Anoka counties, the expansion there, more growth into Wright County. So you can see more the eastern half of Hennepin County, the urban sprawl there, northern Scott, northwestern Dakota, all of Ramsey, and then southern Anoka. And receiving warnings in 1965, as I touched on a little bit earlier, basically it was just the tornado siren. You heard that and you turned on either the television or the radio, if you could even hear the siren. Some people that night on May 6th couldn't even hear the sirens just because they weren't in range of it. So basically, the warning was hearing the hail hitting the roofs. Thankfully, the technology has improved in 50 years. These warnings are pretty much delivered right to your home, either through a weather radio or even your cell phone can broadcast tornado warnings using your location via GPS. So really, there's no way you can avoid warnings. They're available. Some of the questions that remain that night is exactly how many tornadoes occurred that evening. I was just going off official data, um, but it is possible that there could have been 6 or more tornadoes. Some of the early data had 7 tornadoes. Exactly where did they track is another question mark. Um, was there in fact 3 tornadoes over Fridley? Were there tornadoes over central Hennepin County? Um, then distinguishing what damage was caused by tornadoes and what was caused by thunderstorm winds. There's a lot of unknown by that. The science of the river flank downdraft, which can produce tornado-like damage with winds of 100 miles per hour, or that can go in excess of that. That science was in its infancy during the early 1960s. A lot wasn't really known about that, and we were just beginning to understand hook echoes. Those were discovered in the 1950s. I would like to give thanks to these sources here. This is where I got the majority of my information. This was really an interesting project. I've always been fascinated with storms, and I wasn't around back in 1965, so I was always kind of curious as to what exactly happened. And after doing this research, I really got a better picture of what happened that evening. Um, some of the lore, I guess, from this night is there's still a lot of unknowns, and perhaps over time with the technology and just being able to piece all the information together to give us a more definitive answer of what really happened that night. Thank you for listening to this presentation.